SEP FanFic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Days 22. Chapter 30. Holding On and Letting Go. Falling. Simultaneously loud and deafeningly silent. Chaotic and peaceful. Painful and beautiful. Time passed through Hermione's fingers like smoke. Meaningless, shapeless. Each failed swipe of her fingers spread her senses thinner. Lost in the center of an endless maelstrom, darkness and light fought for dominance. They tugged and dragged her from one extreme to the next on a cosmic pendulum. Hermione took a breath, but ice and fire were the only things entering her lungs. Landing was always the hardest part of falling. Her world was reduced to a roaring sea of pain, desperate and hopeless. Drifting, sinking. Go! A garbled whisper struggled from her lips, pulse hammering. She reached blindly, desperately. He's scared. There were voices, orders given, fragments of sentences. Footsteps rushed all around her. She felt as though she were being stabbed repeatedly and weighed down. The air was heavy, but there was energy surrounding her that had no name. A voice in her ear. I will. Draco, hold her steady. Hermione burned in the light. Welcoming the heat, she landed in a field that stretched farther than her eyes could see. Blood bloomed into a sea of roses, wildflowers, and a garden full of fruit. The howl faded into the sigh of her name. Sobs morphed into a broken lullaby. Pain ebbed into a heady pleasure, while dust fell like benevolent rain from the sky. Tears transformed into a flowing river that created new paths and changed course before her eyes. It washed her clean, healed her, made her whole, free. Hermione allowed herself to be carried away by the crimson and gold rays of light dancing around her. Laughing, she reached for the flowers as they harmonized a tune. She touched the silk petals as radiance cradled her, lifting her up into the air on a cloud of rainbows. Her gown shimmered and shifted colors in the dazzling display. Joy, delirious, euphoric, real, but lonely. Flashes of objects beat in a rich hum of shades and shapes that moved in sync with her pulse. She felt each thump as if her heart reached from her head to her toes. Magic ran through her veins. Arms outstretched, water poured from her fingertips, giving life to the flowers beneath her feet. Hermione felt weightless, as if she were pure magic herself. You're hallucinating. Unlike Icarus, the voice stopped her before she flew too close to the sun. A lily sprouted from the earth with its petals open to reveal a vial. Drink. Hermione did as she looked around for the source. Colors pulsed brighter and brighter, like a beacon trying to grab her attention. And soon she was floating with the breeze between her fingers and fanning through her hair as the cloud transformed to an effervescent rainbow. She wanted to touch the rainbow and reach out, but it slipped through her fingers like mist, like a dream or a nightmare. Hermione opened her eyes. She sucked in as much air as her lungs would allow and sputtered until whispered words cleared her clogged airway. The lights were harsh and cold. Hospital. Blue eyes, red hair, freckles, flushed skin. Ron. She couldn't disguise his shock, anxiety, or relief. How the bloody hell are you awake? Hermione turned her head and retched. Gagged, choked, shook. She couldn't stop. Susan! The field hadn't lost its glow. Flowers swayed to the beat of her heart as the rainbow curled around her like a hug, warm and peaceful. The lilies fed her vials of sweet dew. The earth sprouted fruits. Rain fell from the sky, but Hermione remained dry as she picked roses that pricked her fingers then bloomed more. But something was odd. Each time she tried to focus, or begin to wonder just where she was, the world became more vibrant. It worked hard to distract her from the rumble of thunder. Trouble. Breathe. Hermione's pulse kicked with a sudden spike of fear that slipped alongside the euphoria and melted into the space in between. The light suddenly felt too hot, and fear sharpened her senses until she could point out the inconsistencies. The floating, the colors, the petals. Nothing was right. She screamed into the Technicolor void. "I didn't take anything. Please, I didn't take anything." "You're not there." Molly's voice was faint in her ear. "She can't hurt you anymore. It's not real." But the pain was. Screaming and begging filled her ears. The voice sounded like her own, only hoarse and broken, weak from agony. She was drowning in a repeated unforgivable on a drawing room floor. Everything blurred until nothing but white noise remained. Every muscle pulled taut like a wire. Gritting her teeth, Hermione convulsed to the maniacal cadence of laughter. Hermione napped under the warmth of the sun. Drink. She did, and everything was right. And wrong. Panic. It settled like the fog in the corner of her eyes. That hadn't been there before. Or had it? Colors became bolder, but Hermione focused on the fog, ignoring all that was pleasant. It wasn't real. This was her subconscious. A dream. "Dose in." Hermione gasped, and the tightness in her chest unwound just enough to carve out one desperate, panting breath. Then another. Air was lava in her lungs. She's burning through the cooling charms. Slower breaths. Andromeda was out of sight but close. Focus. Hermione followed the thread of her voice, and the world sharpened to reveal Draco above her. His pale, drawn face, gray eyes fixed on hers. He was normally warm, but now his hands felt cold like relief. Draco looked as though he'd crawled through the entirety of hell. "I'm still there." Hermione's fingers skimmed the top of the wildflowers when something changed. Pain. It invaded the field and attacked her from all sides, seeped into her pores, dug into every bone, muscle, and nerve. Pain was a shocking reminder of the loop she was stuck in. It was just a dream, a hallucination. The truth burned. Hermione writhed with the scent of her own flesh in the air until darkness rose. A vial of dew sprang forth from a lily as the voice took a shadowy corporeal form. Drink. The word kick-started a memory. Each request, each vial, she always accepted, always trusted the voice and drank. It was merely a creation of her subconscious. It wouldn't hurt her. The shadow hovered next to her. Its presence doused the flames and healed her charred skin, but it did little for the pain. When she drank, she relished in the relief until her chest heaved as she reeled from the residual agony. "It hurts. It burns." Hermione reached for the mist and came away with ash. "I know." "I'm so tired." The liquid cooled the fire within. "I want to go home." "It's almost over." The fog began to fade, and Hermione's chest constricted as tears burned tracks down her cheeks. "Stay with me, please." She sobbed so hard she thought she would shatter. "I'm tired of being alone." "You're not." The brilliance of the world faded, the specter vanished, and something dark and enormous rose from the depths. It wrapped its arms around her and dragged her into the darkness. "You're here." She wasn't surprised to see Draco in her dreams, but he faded like the flame of a covered candle. "This isn't a dream." Darkness. The cold void was calm like a stream, and cool like a breeze. A peaceful and perfect silence so absolute and enduring it penetrated her soul. Hermione hovered above the current, highs and lows blurring together, and she wondered if this was what it felt like to fly, or fall. Just when she thought the darkness would last forever, beams of light sliced through. They reached in the void and pulled her out. A sudden bang rang out. The sky returned to clear, and all the visions disappeared. She was at the beginning again, and time rolled on. Light. Consciousness crept through her addled mind. Dizzy and groggy, memories flooded in a surge that froze the breath in her lungs. Hermione's vision sharpened. She heard herself groan as she made out features. A face. "Oh, fuck!" Pansy. Hermione returned to the field. Darkness and light cycled, but now she laid in the sun. It was warm on her face and body and hands. The shadow returned to her lonely world for seconds before leaving, and each time the pain of its loss tore at the fabric of reality that didn't exist. Darkness. The next face she saw was bathed in ribbons of sunlight filtering through the window. Luna. "Where am I?" Hermione rasped out. "Shh." A cool cloth touched her head. "Dreams fly on the wings of time." She didn't understand, but her questions were hushed and soothed away. "Back to sleep you go." Hermione helplessly obeyed. Reality shocked Hermione with a punch of adrenaline that should have jolted her into an upright position, but she couldn't feel her arms or legs, let alone move. She was only capable of blinking and breathing. Needing to calm the rising panic, Hermione focused her efforts on the simple act of wiggling her toes. The relief that accompanied the sensation was palpable. "Kingsley!" She could pinpoint Pansy's voice from anywhere. "Theo! Wake up!" Wincing at the sheer volume, Hermione tried and failed to turn away as if she were the too bright sun. "It's too soon for her to be awake." "What?" There was a sudden noise to her left before a disheveled Theo entered her sightline, a picture of unkempt hair and weary eyes. And then there was Kingsley, who looked poised as always, slightly haggard yet relieved. Neither spoke at first. They exchanged looks, then turned to Pansy as if she held all the answers. Hermione was beyond confused. More so when Theo ran a hand through his hair and swore. "Can we hide this?" Kingsley looked deadly serious. "She's not prepared." "It's the middle of the night. We can't smuggle her out now." Pansy bit down on her fingernail. "The plan was to take her to—" "Not an option in her current state." Theo shook his head. "At the very least, I need 12 hours before enough of the potions are out of her system to safely transfer her." Hermione wiggled her toes to get someone's attention. It wasn't enough. "The atrophy—" "Oh, snap out of healing mode!" Pansy sounded harsher than Hermione had ever heard her speak to Theo. "She cannot be here when anyone realizes she's awake. The media is a bloody circus downstairs. Andromeda and Percy keep catching ministry officials and reporters trying to gain access to this room. Oh, and let's not forget our biggest problem, the bastard." Colorful language aside, Miss Parkinson is correct. Kingsley spoke her name with a sort of familiarity that sparked Hermione's curiosity. She knew for a fact the two had never met. "You and Susan have a conference to update the media on her condition in the afternoon. Is that enough time?" "Tiberius will be around for an inspection before then." Hermione blinked rapidly, but no one noticed. "She can fake it." "What?" "I'll make certain Percy is here with you and Draco during the inspection. Keep it quick. Mind Draco's temper." Hermione had never been more confused, not just by their words, which quickly devolved into a rapid-fire three-way debate, but she couldn't wrap her mind around anything enough to keep up with the conversation. Her gaze swept her surroundings. Situated on the edge of her periphery was a colorful display with multiple vases and elaborate flower arrangements. They were beautiful, but her eyes caught on something familiar. Insignificant to some, but it meant the world to her. A small cactus. Mint. It was good that she couldn't speak. Her heart was in her throat. Sudden sensation roused her once more. Bleeding through her veins, it brought her limbs back to life. Hermione still struggled to move, but she managed to open and close one of her hands, wiggle the fingers of her other, and flex the toes on both feet. She wanted to turn back to where the cactus should have been, but she was blinded by a penlight. "Welcome back again." Theo shone the light in her other eye. "How do you feel?" I don't know," Hermione managed, her voice raw and scratchy. He reached out of sight and brought back a cup with a straw. She took a greedy sip. The water tasted better than anything, but he didn't let her gulp. "What happened?" "Too much. I'd rather not overwhelm you." He looked over his shoulder. "Go get—" "Already gone!" Pansy's footsteps echoed across the floor before the door opened, then shut, while Theo ran diagnostic charms and Kingsley raised her bed. Theo seemed pleased with the result of the scan, but Hermione couldn't stop staring around the room. There were plants and flowers on every surface, but her focus went back to the cactus. Looks like the poison is out of your system. Can you? Hermione coughed, and her chest ached with phantom pain. Tell me the truth. Okay. Kingsley took Theo's seat when he moved. Patience radiated off him in a way that calmed her. How long has it been? Theo looked supremely uncomfortable. A week. Hermione tried to absorb the gut punch of the news. 7 days. Last she remembered, it was the 15th, which meant it was now the 22nd. But she had no concept of the hour, only that it was dark. Not that it mattered. Once again, time had passed without her knowing, without her having any memory of it. Blinking up at the ceiling, she took several deep breaths to calm herself down. At least she tried to. Kingsley held her hand, but said nothing when she looked away to swallow the growing lump in her throat. She had missed her birthday. As petty as it seemed, it was all she could think about and obsess over until the thought left her weary enough to know she had to let it go. There was nothing to do about it, nothing that would change the past. There were more pressing matters and questions that needed to be answered. My injuries? Blunt? Please. Theo still had the parchment in hand, but didn't look at it. He didn't need to. Multiple fractures of her ribs and wrist, splinching, damaged lungs, a concussion with a head wound, and an abdominal laceration. Some injuries she remembered, others she didn't. The splinching and the poison were the largest concerns. The poison had been in your system far too long, and we had difficulty treating you because of this. But Draco had the idea of mixing the antidote with replenishing potion to force it out faster, and it worked. Theo gave her a moment to absorb his words. Your body is under a lot of stress, and you're on an obscene amount of potions right now. We had to get creative with the combination. I don't feel much of anything. Heavy, groggy. It's hard to think. I feel like I could sleep for years, but I know I just woke up. A little pain, but if you're able to feel any pain, I'm shocked. But we've begun the process of weaning you off the heavier pain potions. We can manage it carefully and keep you as comfortable as possible. For the first time, Hermione paid attention to the state of her arms when Theo reached across her. Wrapped in heavy bandages, she could barely feel her fingers. How bad is it? The trauma to your wrist was extensive. The rest of your arm was partially splinched, so the bandage is to protect your new skin. Theo touched the tips of each finger. We did as much as we could, fix the ligaments, regrew skin and bones, but you'll need therapy and time to heal. Will I fully recover? Brewing, cooking, working. And so many other ways she used her hands. This was a nightmare. Right now I'm not certain, as it's not my area of expertise. Susan thinks there's a high chance you'll end up with a tremor and believes you should start therapy as soon as possible. Nothing has been done on that front because we wanted to see how you were when you woke up. You had 2 seizures in all of this, and... Okay. Hermione felt that news like a brisk wind. Stunned, she shivered while struggling to process everything. But there was more, and her curiosity wouldn't allow it to be left unsaid. Keep going. The seizures were a result of the poison, not stress. That didn't make it any better. You mentioned splinching. Where? Down your right side. You lost skin, muscle, hair, a few fingers, and half your leg in the process. We reattached and grew what was lost, but the process wasn't simple because of how it was splinched. He moved back the covers, and she saw her leg, as well as the ugly sight of bruised and raised skin that stretched from her knee to her foot. A straight line. Half of her leg in the most literal of terms. Hermione couldn't fathom the sight. No wonder. Kingsley covered it up. What else? She swallowed thickly. Theo's face shifted to concern. Let me know if... Just tell me. Theo and Kingsley had a silent conversation that ended with the latter nodding before Theo continued. We grew your skin and muscles back, and used healing charms and as much dittany as we could to close the wounds, but there will likely be scarring on your arm and down your right side. Roger had to stitch you up to hold you together long enough for the antidote to begin working before we were able to start repairing the damage. The poison... From the boxes? Yes. Kingsley nodded after Theo gestured for him to take over. It was packed into boxes that were planted in time to go off and cause maximum chaos while the Aurors were dealing with a different situation in the city. One didn't work, though, right? I remember... The last one. You're correct. It didn't take Harry long to figure out how they made it past security, and he apprehended the sympathizer, who confessed straight away. She's cooperating, by the way. Who? A Mediwitch that was coincidentally injured in the initial blast. She said you revived her, healed her, and told her to hide. Your compassion moved her. It made her talk. Hermione's mind was racing. Padma, released 3 days ago. I want to see her. We need to talk about that. But it's also the middle of the night, and we have to figure out... The rest of his words were lost. Memories flashed wildly in her mind. Words, pain, healing Padma, falling leaves, a howl, crashing, a room with faces. So much blood. There was a hand on her shoulder and another one squeezing hers. Kingsley. Your heart rate just spiked. Theo's concern was evident despite the calm he tried to project. We don't have to talk about it. But we do. Kingsley frowned slightly. Much has happened since, and she needs to be informed of the basics at the very least. Like what? The public outcry after the attack on St. Mungo's has put the Ministry in a position where they must take decisive action. The Wizengamot is publicly controlling the investigation, but we know the Death Eaters have gone to ground and spread out because of the notes you left. Hermione looked up at the ceiling and took a breath. Harry has a few trusted people leading a covert investigation into the ones that are still actively moving. We're keeping it a secret for now, but locations of hideouts have been found all over the country. They've learned more in a week than the past years combined. What are these inspections about? Tiberius has visited daily in an attempt to convince Miss Parkinson to allow him to secure your memories. He wants Padma's as well, which is why we discharged her quietly and sent her away until she's well enough to make a statement. As for you, he seems particularly fixated on yours and has attempted to obtain them 3 times while you were unconscious. It's widely believed you've witnessed something. I don't remember. And that is why he wants your memories. You might have seen without seeing. While Kingsley's presence was nice, it was very odd. Is that why you're here? My presence was requested as a trusted individual to keep watch. Knowledge was often a painful double-edged sword. Hermione knew this, but now its blade was poised to slice into her reality. Heavy emotions were just at the surface, waiting to bleed from the first cut, dying to be felt. You've experienced a lot of trauma. A moment passed that made Hermione wonder when she would feel like herself again. Was that even possible? She smothered the thought. Rest. Kingsley's wisdom was reinforced by the hand on her shoulder. He's right. Theo placed the parchment on the table. It will be the only way you heal. Right. Her rueful chuckle sounded slightly hysterical to her own ears. Spoken like a healer and not a hospital owner. Or a friend. Hermione lowered her head and looked off to the side to avoid the swell in her throat. The condition of her body, and the memories of the scars and bruises she could see, and the ones she couldn't. I know better than to order you to do anything, but I'm serious when I say no heavy lifting. Nothing strenuous or stress-inducing. Trauma has made your body fragile, and you need to rebuild your strength. Right now, no reading or writing, and at least for the next 6 weeks, no work, no gardening, no tending, no mental work, no menial tasks. I mean it. Nothing. Hermione didn't have the strength to do anything, much less fight. There was a quick knock on the door, followed by a softer one. Theo stood while Kingsley answered. Hermione expected Pansy, and she was there, only she was dwarfed by the presence beside her. Draco. Kingsley gripped Draco's shoulder in support as he passed, and a look passed between the 2 men before the former continued on. Theo did the same, but shut the door behind him, after murmuring something to Draco she didn't hear. Not that she noticed. Hermione couldn't stop watching him. Draco was dressed impeccably, but he looked exhausted. Pale, frayed at the seams, unshaven. He said nothing as he pulled a chair to her left side and sat down. Silence rolled on, but all was not still. Least of all when Draco picked up her uninjured hand. His palm nearly swallowed hers whole as he held it. He dipped his head, not to kiss her knuckles, but to rest her fist against his cheek. Comfort found in something as simply complex as touch. Hermione knew better than to speak, had no words, but slowly opened her hand to feel the warmth of his face on her palm, ignoring the slight clamminess of his skin and the scratchiness of his facial hair. When he leaned into her touch, blunt weariness rolled off him like fog descending down a darkened hall. Spreading through his demeanor, his lids hung at half-mast over his eyes. She wondered if he would fall asleep holding her like this. She wondered if she should let him. "I have a few minutes." His words were quiet, spoken just for her. "They want you to rest." "You brought the cactus here." Scorpius insisted. Gray eyes locked on hers. "Wouldn't let me leave without it." "Don't bring him here." "I won't. I haven't." Draco shifted in his seat. "He's with the Potters at the Burrow. They've kept him occupied. He's on edge, not signing. The first day was rough. When I returned home alone, I've never seen him so distraught." Hermione shut her eyes, and the first stab of pain bloomed in her chest. "I talked to him and stayed with him as much as I could, given everything." "What's going on?" Because she knew he wouldn't lie to her. He hadn't before. "I feel like there's a lot of missing pieces I'm trying to find." "In the morning." When Draco tried to let go of her hand and began to stand, Hermione squeezed. "Stay." He stopped, looked at her, didn't leave. Carefully shifting made just enough room for him in the small bed. He had to stay on his side, but his presence made the struggle worth it. Draco was careful with each action as he wrapped an arm around her, and she turned her head to him. The breaths that followed were measured by the beat of their hearts. Silence stretched into infinity. Foreheads touching, eyes drinking each other in. They blinked slowly, steadily. He looked at her with something he didn't have the words to articulate. Feelings and sentiment played on the tip of her tongue, ready to be expressed, but held back under the same weight that held her down. Draco's hand curling on the blanket that covered her was the only insight he gave into the true state of his emotions beneath the waves of exhaustion. His storm called to her. "Are you sleeping?" She murmured so softly she wondered if he could even hear it. "I haven't been able to." Startled by the painful undercurrent of his answer, and lost in the swell of the unknown between them, Hermione reached out as much as she could, using nearly all her effort. She lifted her free hand to his cheek and swept her thumb over it repeatedly. The rest of her energy was devoted to brushing her lips against his and letting them linger as if there was nothing more vital in the world than the single kiss. This fragile moment. Firm but soft, Draco held on and didn't stop kissing her until his heavy eyes shut and his body slowly relaxed. He was breathing deeply in seconds, and so was she. September 23rd, 2011. Pain was a shock of ice-cold water. Terrible. But beneath it was a startling jolt of clarity where Hermione's mind, body, and emotions were all slotted back into place. Her body felt like it had been passed through a grinder, and her mind was broken into pieces, both of which were dulled with the lesser doses of potion. The loosening of the bind on her emotions was a slow one, more dangerous. Less like a panic attack, it was the dawning realization of what had happened, what she had been through, what she had survived. The fear, the pain, the helplessness, the violence. Greyback's hands on her, the screams and choking, the blood, the silence. Memories waged a war in her mind. Unrelenting, they trapped her into a feeling everything, reeling from each memory, and left her paralyzed with thoughts she couldn't express. She stared at nothing, unblinking. Hungry but unable to eat, exhausted but unable to sleep. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours, and hours rolled on like days. Time was a construct, separated by rotations of people beginning the moment she woke up alone, with a familiar parchment at her side. There was a drawing of what looked like a cross between a dragon and a cow, clearly done by Albus, scribbles by Lily, stick figures by James, and a small note in green marker that could have only been from one boy. His handwriting wasn't much better than his father's. Feel better. She didn't know if her heart was breaking or if the pain she felt was because it was healing. The next half hour she held Harry's hand while Ron sat quietly beside him, looking thoughtful but wisely keeping to himself. The moment was broken when they had to go. Their time was up. Susan's check-in began with a long hug and a demand for a girls' night where they all would get unapologetically blitzed when she was well enough. Then she started working, walking Hermione through what potions to take when. By the time Daphne arrived, Andromeda had been through to coerce her into eating something, but Hermione hadn't had the stomach for it. She held her for so long Hermione rolled through several emotions and landed on gratitude. She sank into her embrace, then Daphne's. And now Pansy was fretting over the state of her partly splinched hair, but all Hermione felt was the grip of Greyback's hand as he dragged her away from Padma, and cut it. Everything stopped. What? Hermione sounded incredulous. It's only one part that's shorter than the rest. Cut off as much as you need to. But all your hair! Daphne genuinely seemed sad. I am not defined by my hair. It'll grow back. I need you to cut it. It took time, but Pansy didn't ask any further questions. It was as if she quietly understood. More than expected was left behind, and they washed and dried it but left it down. Hermione thought she would feel something in the aftermath with it gone, but all she felt was lighter. Relieved. When can I go home? It was all she wanted to do. She needed to feel in the privacy of her own world. Go home and take the time to heal her wounds and recover. Everyone exchanged looks. Obviously there was something she didn't know. A knock on the door made everyone stop. 3 wands instantly pointed at the door so quick it stunned her quiet. But the second, softer knock made them relax. They're early. Draco peeked his head in. Percy is walking him to the lift now. Hermione didn't like the way the 2 words caused the entire room to burst into activity. Everything was a blur of motion that left Hermione reeling while sitting still. Packing spells were uttered while Susan and Daphne gathered everything in a rush. All proof of her being awake, cups and leftover hospital food, were all taken away and both quickly exited. Daphne went to get everything ready for her quiet discharge while Susan prepped the parchment. Draco and Pansy exchanged a few words in the corner before he appeared at Hermione's side. His only response to her obviously shorter hair was a quick blink. Do you know occlumency? I can barely tell when you occlude. I just know that you do. Hermione frowned at the strange question. Is this about my memories? Yes. It pulled her thoughts back to Kingsley and Theo's discussion. No way was she ready to go toe-to-toe with Tiberius or anyone. What do I need to do? As it turned out, all Draco needed her to do was feign sleep. Easy enough. Eyes shut, ears open, Hermione slowed her breathing and listened. The knock on the door. Multiple footsteps indicating that he was not alone. First, she heard Percy's greeting, noting the way he spoke to Pansy formally, and then it was followed by Tiberius's terse greeting. Mr. Malfoy, Miss Parkinson. Tiberius paused, and Hermione knew he was looking at her. I see Miss Granger has not awakened yet. Pity. She has not. Pansy's tone held an edge of terseness, not quite like a blade, but something sleek yet jagged. I believe Mr. Weasley informed you of this upon your arrival. He did, however. I wanted to visit and continue to offer my humble additions to the overwhelming number of well-wishes that fill this room. I am concerned for her well-being just as the rest of the public is. I confess I am too hasty in my desire for more information on her condition. She has always been a fighter. Percy's comment held weight etched in respect. She has done much, and we should allow her to rest undisturbed. Chief Warlock, if you would like, I can escort you back to the flue. There was a long pause. Thank you, yes. Pansy placed her hand on top of Hermione's. Then everything shifted. Actually, there is something I wish to say. Tiberius's voice sounded closer, almost as if he were standing at her bedside. Miss Parkinson, as Miss Granger's advocate, I implore you to see reason and provide the Ministry with her memory of the unfortunate event. Hermione expected a sarcastic response, but she never spoke. The DMLE is conducting an investigation with the Auror's office, and the task force is taking the lead. Draco's voice was firm. What exactly are you investigating? I am merely assisting in any way I can. Her memory could solve some lingering questions. I want answers just like everyone else. How something like this could happen. I am certain there are plenty of other things you could do, Chief Warlock. Draco stepped towards Tiberius, and she knew it was him by the methodical way he walked. I can think of 2 at this moment. Assuaging the public fears and increasing the security threat level. Neither of which require your presence or Hermione's memories, Pansy added. Very well. Tiberius cleared his throat. I have attempted niceties, and it seems as though this matter will need to be handled officially. Shocking that you even know how to do that. Ah, and there it is, Mr. Malfoy, the Chief Warlock taunted. This spark of temper you so boldly displayed in last week's conflagration. I confess, I am confused to find you here when you have nothing to do with the current investigation. Conflagration? Outside of the simple fact that I found her, the reason for my presence is none of your concern. Might I remind you that we might not be within the walls of the ministry and you might be on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into your actions, but I am still your superior, and I demand the respect as my respect cannot be demanded. The last time she'd heard Draco sound so severe was the night of their argument. The heavy tension surrounding her made it hard to keep still and feign unconsciousness. Draco. Percy's tone held a quiet call for civility, but he did not utter an apology. Miss Parkinson. Tiberius was laying it on so thick he sounded greasy. While I understand that you and Mr. Malfoy are friends, yes, but my decision to not let anyone poke around in Hermione's head while she's unconscious and suffering trauma and injuries has been made because I'm the advocate she selected. Pansy let go of her hand, and the bed shifted when she stood. This is not what she would want. It's not at all ethical, however hard you may try to weave this. So please, do what you feel you must, and so will I until Hermione wakes. I believe Miss Granger would want to assist in the investigation. And she will. Percy wisely still maintained temperance. When she wakes. Come now, allow me to escort you to the flue. Hermione didn't move until she heard the door open and shut. Another few seconds passed before she opened her eyes and looked directly at Pansy, whose face held a hint of color. She was thrumming with irritation as intensely as Hermione was with questions. What did I see? Thinking about it hurt, but she tried. We have everything ready to move during Theo's statement to the media. I'll go sign the rest of the papers, and... The rest of Pansy's comment was lost. She left her side and then the room, destination unknown. Hermione ran a shaky hand through her hair, and her head pounded louder with each passing second. Do you need a pain potion? Not yet. She tried to breathe through the growing discomfort. I'm trying to remember. Stop. Draco walked around the bed as Hermione tracked his movements, wondering and questioning his next decision. The brief thought of him leaving died when she took off his jacket and dropped it on the table before picking up 2 vials and approaching the bed. Here. I don't want. Drink. Hermione's breath caught. You. She shook her head, trying to clear out the clutter. Draco offered nothing, only uncorking the first vial while she stared at him. You were hallucinating. No one could get you to drink the antidote doses. Except you. Much to our eternal surprise, you listened. He cleared his throat and looked down. Take the potion, Granger. I believe you once told me that it's stupid to suffer needlessly. Like in the field of dreams, Hermione drank the potion and handed back the empty vial. Then the second. Relief was instant. I haven't thanked you for Scorpius. There was nothing to thank me for. I would do it again. All of it. He was my first thought. If anything, There was a twinging in her gut as physical as the pain she'd taken the potion to dull. You talked to me through my delusions. I don't think thank you is adequate, but that's the only phrase I know to express my gratitude. Likewise. It was all still a murky dream that she felt both attached and detached from. She recalled those last moments when he served as the peace in her storm. They had been so real. Solid. Something else? You found me. Draco nodded with a tight jaw. He still looked tired, despite how vehemently he'd stood up against Tiberius. Not as bad as last night, He was at least clean-shaven, but still quite pale.
I did.
The letters were the only thing I could think of to grab in the worst-case scenario.
It qualified.
Draco ran a hand over his face, appearing weary yet careful with what he divulged.
I found where Greyback took you. Plenty of blood, but no body. He's injured, but
what about the notes I left with the others?
Some were still unconscious. 5 escaped and have gone to ground with other Death Eaters, all in different locations. Potter's been working the case and preparing for the raids in my absence.
Absence?
It's a relatively long story.
That involves a large fire?
Partly.
He pinched the bridge of his nose and rubbed his eyes again.
I'd tell you more, but Theo's conference is in 2 hours, and you look overwhelmed.
As do you. Draco's eyes slid to her, but Hermione peered down at her bandaged arm, then over to her side where her skin begged to be scratched. Everything was uncomfortable, and it left Hermione feeling raw and vulnerable. Her mind picked up the pace to run at top speed about what had happened and what hadn't, what was and what wasn't. I'd rather not be alone with my thoughts.
I have no intention of leaving you to them.
His words didn't startle her, but his tone did. Draco didn't move. The stillness prompted her to continue. To be honest, I remember things. Her words were quiet. The forest and the sky. I remember choking and feeling pain. I remember thinking that I was alone. Hermione blinked back tears. The metaphorical dam began to crumble. You should take my memories now. Draco extracted his wand and summoned an empty vial. Hermione shut her eyes as she felt a hand curl around her shoulder, gently pulling her against his solid chest. She focused on his chin against the crown of her head, the tip of his wand at her temple, and breathed in the scent of him, and this new sense of peace she felt in his presence.
It's done.
His grounding hands couldn't stop her from feeling the last sliver of calm receding as memories finally took hold. On any other day, Hermione might have tried to stuff it all back down. She might have even been successful. She was good at fighting it off. But today she was tired, bruised and cut, beaten and broken, hollowed out. Her wet face was proof of just how exhausted she was, how empty she felt. I can't keep this inside.
Then don't.
There was bravery in fear, and strength in surrender. Peace, even if Hermione felt as though her soul was drowning under the tidal wave of emotions. Memories dragged her out to sea, but she held on to him like a lifeline, grounding herself in his embrace in the act of letting go. A sob tore from her when she finally allowed herself to seek comfort and shelter in something other than herself. Tears felt when she put her trust in where she found it, in his arms, in his touch, in the beat of his heart, in the unintelligible words Draco whispered against her temple. Hermione shut her eyes, cracked herself open, and allowed herself a moment just to feel and succumb. Draco slept like the dead in the reclining chair. His hand was a solid weight firmly entwined with hers, and his head was turned in her direction. He didn't look comfortable, awkward even. His arm had to be as stiff as hers, but Hermione didn't let go. Mint and the flowers on the table behind him made for an interesting contrast of color above a man dressed in black, but she only watched the rise and fall of his chest, and focused on the deep evenness of his breaths, as steady as the pull of gravity. Uncharacteristic, really, as was the sight of him. His hair was unkempt, splayed across his forehead, and there were wrinkles in the back of his shirt, and the blanket on his lap moved up to his shoulders, covering him completely, except for his arm. Hermione jolted when she realized they weren't alone. She turned to find Pansy at the foot of the bed, wand in hand, and exhaling her relief. I'm glad he's asleep. He's exhausted from all the back and forth. Her voice was low, careful not to disturb the sleeping man as she approached the other side of the bed. I'd ask about the state of your hand, but I'll hold my peace. A quick moment of eye contact passed between them. For now. Not a threat, but a promise. I'm still processing the last week. Back to therapy you go, She wasn't wrong. Pansy sat on the edge near the foot of the bed. I'm still processing the fact that I'm your legal advocate, along with I told you ages ago. I didn't think you were serious, Pansy pouted petulantly. It's been hell for the last week. Why would you trust me? Why wouldn't I? I let you cut my hair. I trust you with my home. You and Ginny know me best, which meant more to Hermione than she could express. I trust you to make the right decisions. That's different from your life. I would have left it to Weasley, but she had Scorpius and the 3 very upset kids to contend with. Hermione ached at the thought. They both looked at Draco. Give him a few more minutes to rest. Everyone else is completing their tasks. Tasks? Hermione tilted her head. After cracking her knuckles, Pansy proceeded to explain how they'd banded together. Percy made sure her legal affairs were in order and made certain they knew about each visit from Tiberius. Neville tended to her garden, with Narcissa's help. Luna split her time between staying at Hermione's side and entertaining the children to give Ginny a moment of reprieve. They all took care of the chickens. Fresh in town, Charles Smith had stepped in with Narcissa's care and delegated tasks between Saxe and Keating. Ron had visited once, but mainly served as the liaison between Susan and her parents, who were placed in a secure location for protective caution. Daphne and Ginny alternated children duties while getting everything together for her bruise. Looks like you thought of everything. I had help. There was a meaningful pause and a glance to the side. The moment you're all healed up, you owe me several strong drinks I've not been allowed to have. I didn't realize how much you do and how much you have to hold together. I am not sure what we all would have done without Drake. Pansy broke off to clear her throat, but it was too late. Every road led to him. The steady presence in her mind. What did he do? Draco is good at delegating. Pansy gave him a sad look. It's not always the best kind of experience. The implication and the source of his competence was painful. How are you feeling? Less overwhelmed? It sounded as though Pansy had heard a bit of her breakdown, but Hermione couldn't muster the shame she thought she should feel. At the moment, I'm numb, and not. Have you worked out the discharge? Yes, everything has been set up. Where? About that. Hermione was too weak to return to her home. That much she knew. While unconscious, there had been sightings of Death Eaters in the area surrounding Godric's Hollow. Too close for anyone to take chances. The Malfoys. The security is better than anywhere, and the location is central. You also can't travel by magic, as you're at high risk for resplinching, so... Okay. Well, shite. Pansy's eyes widened. I was expecting a fight. I made notes. No need. It makes sense. Hermione glanced at their entwined hands. Besides, if she couldn't be home, that was probably the best place for her to recover. I might not be able to assist, but at least some of my work... Let someone else handle that for now, Pansy said as gently as she could, which was still a bit brusque. You'll be there to oversee the monitoring of Narcissa's care. But... Stop. Hermione turned to the sound of Draco's gruff voice. His eyes were narrowed in a bleary scowl. It will be handled. No room for argument was found in his deep timbre, in the set expression, in the way his hand tightened in hers. It reminded her of the trust she'd already put in him and everyone else, however unknowingly. She had to do it again. Smuggling Hermione out of the hospital was easier than anticipated. What she hadn't expected was the vigil in the lobby of St. Mungo's. There were flowers and gifts and people everywhere. Hermione hadn't considered the outpouring of concern, or her place as a war hero when she'd taken those notes. She had no idea the public would be in a frenzy about her recovery. All their attention was on Theo, who was now dressed completely opposite of how he'd looked when she'd woken up. Susan had just finished updating the media on her condition when Theo opened the floor for questioning. Everyone started speaking at once. After a few distraction charms to anyone who looked curiously in their direction, a hovering charm and a disillusionment charm set on her, Hermione was wheeled outside to the car Daphne hardly drove, and it showed. How did you pass the Muggle test? Pansy said the moment they pulled in front of the Malfoys' home. You drive like a skeleton. I don't understand the... Dead! Daphne, you drive slower than the dead! While they squabbled, Hermione looked at the home. For as lavish as it was inside, the outside appeared as humble as a home could be in an affluent neighborhood. It looked no grander than the homes on either side, which, knowing Draco, had to have been his aim when purchasing it. A brown brick structure surrounded by a wrought iron fence. A house that served as protection, not quite a home. How are your legs? Do you think... Daphne never finished the question because Draco materialized just inside the gate that opened automatically, allowing him to walk out and his stride uninterrupted. Draco, can you take her inside? Daphne asked. I don't think it's suspicious at all if we do a featherlight charm. She basically has baby giraffe legs. Hermione glared at both of them, especially Pansy when she threw her head back and laughed. She opened her mouth to argue that she could walk by herself, thank you very much, but Draco only inclined his head once before picking her up bridal style. Hermione's arms immediately went around his neck, and she looked over his shoulder to find Pansy and Daphne exchanging smirks before following them inside. Where's Scorpius? Inside. The door opened for Draco before they reached it. He knows you're coming. Can we reunite in your office? I think he'd be most comfortable seeing me there. Draco deposited her in the office on the sofa. A split decision made her ask him to glamour her bruises so as not to scare Scorpius. Daphne and Pansy followed after Draco when he left. Hermione felt oddly nervous alone in the silence as she waited. Looking around, she noticed the portrait of a family that looked the same now, but was very, very different. Draco wasn't alone when he returned. Scorpius was at his side, and his hand was wrapped around 3 of his father's fingers. The relief of the moment brought tears to her eyes, and to his as well. Apprehension visibly grew in him. Anxiety stopped him in his tracks. As best as she could, Hermione signed to him that she was okay, but he didn't sign back. Tears continued to stream down his cheeks. It looked like he was in shock. Draco rested his hands on his son's shoulders as Hermione offered hers out to the little boy. Her body was heavy and pain began to throb, but she was more focused on him. It's okay. I'm here. Her voice seemed to restart him, and he tentatively stepped away from his father and gripped her hands. I know you were scared, but you did so good. You were so brave. Hermione ignored her pain and hugged him like she wanted, like she knew he needed. She let him scramble into her lap when he started sobbing harder, but still she held him, let him bury his face in her neck, and whispered reassurances. Anything to let him know that she was here and she was real. She wasn't going anywhere. Not if she could help it. Hermione didn't let go until he settled, resting her cheek on the top of his head. She let him become a grounding weight on her and peered at Draco. Except for the cracks, he looked fine, still tired and only concerned for Scorpius. I didn't expect that. Draco caught her wince and stepped forward. I'll take him. It doesn't hurt that bad. She could tell he didn't believe her. I needed this just as much as he does. Draco didn't argue, and Scorpius soon fell asleep with a hand gripping her shirt. His weight against her was a part of a peace she desperately needed. Each soft breath expressed his exhaustion in the initial moments of sleep. It wasn't long before sleep took her, too. September 24th, 2011. Hermione woke late that morning in a familiar bed with not just 1, but 4 children asleep next to her. Smiling at the endearing sight, she brushed the red fringe from James's face and made her first attempt at walking on her own. It ended before she could even apply enough weight to stand. Unforgiving pain shot through her leg and up her spine. A small knock preceded an unexpected person. Narcissa. Accompanied by Zippy and Andromeda, she carried 3 vials of potions Hermione took with no argument before settling back into bed. The elf left to run her a bath, as instructed by the sisters who remained behind. Narcissa settled gracefully on the edge of the bed. They refused to leave. Andromeda nodded fondly at the children who slept on. It was a chaotic mess of small limbs and intermittent snores. Lily looked dangerously close to kicking Albus in the shin, and the only way she'd been able to spot Scorpius was the tuft of blonde hair sticking from underneath the covers, and the fact that Albus had an arm thrown around him. She had a feeling he'd had to stake his claim over that spot before his siblings could. Her smile grew. I think you have guards. Hermione chuckled, but eyed Narcissa critically. How have you been feeling? Your potions, and I suppose it is not in your nature to stop worrying about everyone for too long. It's not. Andromeda laughed and shook her head. The sisters exchanged looks. However, Miss Granger, I am fine. Narcissa placed a hand over hers. The concern has been more about your condition, naturally. In the interest of your peace of mind, Mr. Smith has adhered to your care plan and has been available to facilitate with all the occupational therapists. I have been assisting in your garden with Mr. Longbottom. He makes decent company." High praise, and far better than Hermione expected. She could only imagine the conversations between Narcissa and Neville while weeding and pruning the plants in her garden. Hermione coughed delicately into her fist, but said nothing. "Pansy has brought some of your things here and unpacked them." They heard the water turn on. "The office you maintain is across the hall, and has been filled with the books that were laid about in your home office. I'm not supposed to read just yet. But they are there for you when you can. I expect your stay will be lengthy." "Thank you for your hospitality. I'm hoping to get my strength back quickly so I can return to my—"
"I know what you're doing." Narcissa's mouth slipped into a frown. "I'm guilty of doing it myself."
"I am as well," Andromeda said. "You have been through a traumatic experience, Miss Granger. There is no rush back to normality," Andromeda added. "Take your time, rehab your body, and rest your mind. Do take care of yourself for once. I'd like my healer back." Hermione looked between the Black sisters. "I'm not used to resting in this capacity, or letting anyone else take care of me." "You are capable of learning many things. This will be merely another life lesson. Have a soak in the bath. Mr. Potter has gone to secure your parents from the safe house, and will bring them here this evening for tea after dinner. So we shall revisit the topic of conversation tomorrow when we go to the spa. But no arguments." It seemed that no one with black blood was accepting any. With a sigh that was almost as resigned as she felt, Hermione agreed. Narcissa looked pleased, clasping her hands together primly before standing. She was not ready when Narcissa offered her hand next to Andromeda's, and they both helped her to stand, or when they slowly helped her walk to the bathroom on unsteady legs. Hermione remained in shock with each step they took. Modesty was reduced to nothing. While Narcissa checked the water, Andromeda helped Hermione out of her hospital garb and unwrapped her bandaged arm. The glamour bled away, and Hermione took a moment to look at herself. A week had changed her, hollowed her out, and left her thinner. It was hard to tell what parts of her skin were new, and harder to tell given the cuts and black and blue patches covering so much of her body. She wasn't sure where one ended and the other began, and then she caught sight of her neck, the vicious handprint staining her skin. No wonder Scorpius had sobbed upon seeing her. Even glamours couldn't hide the haunted look in her eyes. Hermione forced herself to look away. Bubbles and hot water did little to soothe her mind. When left alone to bathe, she let her thoughts run wild and free. Analysis made her feel normal, and talking herself through her own memories allowed her to rationalize. She tried to fill the gaps and crevices, but she couldn't. Then she tried desperately not to panic about it. Sighing and cursing, Hermione submerged herself completely under the water and held her breath until her lungs burned with painful memories that made her resurface. She scrubbed her skin almost raw to distract herself from the thoughts that would send her flying into the atmosphere. And then she cried, and understood the catharsis in the act while acknowledging that healing and coping were things that would take time, patience, and support. Things she wasn't lacking. Hermione struggled to her feet after what seemed like hours, but felt proud of the small victory. Weak, but able to stand. She had to find the silver lining in all of this, or she would go mad. She had to understand the meaning. Andromeda helped her dress, wrapped her in fresh bandages, rubbed minty salve on her raised, tender flesh, and helped her sit at the vanity. She washed and brushed her hair, dried it, and added a little sleek-easies to tame it. It didn't take much. Hermione felt strange with her hair to her collar instead of down her back. She started to rise, but Narcissa stopped her and took over Andromeda's spot. She could only watch as, bit by bit, Narcissa braided her hair back into a single French braid with a serene expression on her face. This wasn't her first time. Her hands moved with muscle memory, mouth humming an unfamiliar tune. Andromeda froze as emotions warred on her face. It sounded like a lullaby from a memory. When Narcissa finished, she admired her work, but frowned at the bruises. "You don't have to keep them." "I think I need the reminder." She learned from Pansy that bruises weren't only a sign of trauma, they were a sign of healing, of survival. She would wear them like a crown. Scorpius never let her out of his sight. His father, however, surreptitiously about it, wasn't much better. Hermione hadn't slept so much in her life. unable to stay awake longer than brief little snatches throughout the course of the day. Potions from Draco, water from Pansy, bandage changes from Andromeda, and bits of soup courtesy of Ginny. One time she woke to whispers in the hall, but Draco noticed and shut the door. Too tired for questions, too distracted by Scorpius and Al painting beside her bed, she'd shut her eyes and fallen back to sleep with the blend of colors from each canvas fresh on her mind. She didn't see Draco until she was cognizant enough to desire a change of scenery. A featherlight charm from Pansy brought her to the living room, just as he emerged from the flue with Harry in tow. Both were tense, but their moods seemed to mellow out over the course of the meal. Hermione found herself in quiet awe of the blended group of people in a place she had never seen them together, inside the Malfoys' home. Ginny and the Potters brought noise to the quiet and chaos to the order. Andromeda and Narcissa had different reactions. The former smiled while listening to James rattle on about his new school, and the latter gave Lily a puzzled look when she meowed. Hermione remained quiet, too tired to eat, but she did because Scorpius wasn't the only child that only ate food after she did. Lily's squint remained until Hermione ate her last bite. At once, the 4 children started eating. Pansy chuckled until Scorpius gave her a long, unamused look. Draco smothered his gruff amusement with his fist. Once dinner concluded and everyone left, after long hugs, Scorpius remained, never venturing far. He stood in the doorway when she took her potions, sat next to her when Susan came through the flue to check her over, and even peered over the back of the sofa as she took a few wobbly steps with Draco's hands on her waist. Scorpius scrutinized everything, much like she remembered from her early days of caring for his grandmother. She understood why, and she talked to him about it. "Are you worried?" Draco signed Hermione's question, noting the way Scorpius stole looks at her bandaged arm with heightened apprehension. Yes, he opened his fist and signed another word. Hurt. "I am." There was no sense in lying to him. "It's going to take time, but I'm going to heal, and I'm going to stay here while I do." Hermione held out her wrist slowly, unable to move it much, but Scorpius laid a hand on it so gently she would have never known he touched her at all, had she not seen it for herself. "Do you know what helped me so much when I woke up? Seeing Mint by my side." Ignoring Draco's confused squint at the cactus's name, she instead smiled at his son's bashful response and pulled him into a hug that seemed to perk him into leaving her side long enough for bath time. The promise of a book from his father sped him along. A bit of normality after a chaotic week. Scorpius remained glued to her side while Draco read Dilly the Dragon Learns to Fly. Barely paying attention, eyes on her, he stared heavily. He was struggling to stay awake and blinking blearily while she ran a hand over his hair. "I'm not going anywhere," Hermione murmured. It took another story about constellations for him to finally drift off. She waited until he'd gone fully slack against her side before nodding to Draco to put him to bed. Hermione took down her braid and almost fell asleep waiting for his return, but was roused at the sound of him kneeling in front of her. "Your parents are here." He looked down at her bare feet. "Do you need assistance?" "I could use a hand, but you don't have to carry me or use magic. I need to move to regain my strength." Draco appeared slightly irritated, but positioned himself optimally for her to take tentative steps under the guise of independence. He was strong, had a firm grip on her, and admittedly held more of her weight. They made it to the door. "When do you start therapy?" "Monday." "How exactly are you getting there?" I hadn't thought about it." She considered the idea of muggle travel with Daphne or Pansy, then reconsidered the latter. She wasn't actually trying to die. "Definitely Daphne. Why do you ask?" "No reason." It was slow progress. By the time they got a few steps outside the door, Hermione's legs were wobbling and she was tired, nauseated, and irritated about the feelings. Like the final bits of sand in an hourglass, Draco's patience ran out and he abruptly scooped her up like she weighed nothing. Hermione didn't yelp too loudly, and instinctively held on as he nudged the door to his office shut with his foot. There were things she tried not to notice during the walk down the hall, particularly the feel of him, but it was something she couldn't argue. Just like the undercurrent of sandalwood and mint. Her parents were seated in the living room. Between bits of conversation, her mother surveyed the high ceilings and crown molding while attempting to disguise her awe at the luxury of their home. Her dad was making light and polite conversation with Narcissa, who had situated herself in the armchair.
Arms pleasantly folded, she was sporting her public persona, bland and interpersonal but falsely engaging. Her mother was not eating it up. Tea had been served on a set Hermione had never seen, likely by Zippy, as she highly doubted Narcissa even knew where tea was. Before they were noticed, Draco set her down and didn't let go of her arm as he assisted her into the room. Greeting her parents was interesting. Emotion broke through her dad's face and relief radiated off of him. She found herself wrapped in a tight hug the moment Draco let her go. She hadn't realized how much she needed it, or how hard she would sink into his embrace. He didn't let her go until she was ready, and her mother gave her another hug, but this one didn't last long. By the time Hermione was finished greeting her parents, Narcissa had excused herself from the room. Draco was gone as well, to give them privacy. "Oh, Hermione, your bruises!" Her mother noticed something else that brought her to the very verge of tears. "Your hair!" She tucked away the irritation that tried to arise. "They'll heal, and my hair will grow back." Her dad helped her sit down between them. "Ron told us everything once they had us secured at the safe house. How are you?" "I'm as okay as I can be." Hermione had more questions than answers. "How did you both end up in the safe house?" "Oris showed up at the house with Harry and asked us quickly to pack a bag. Before we knew it, we were at an undisclosed location. Ron kept us up to date on your condition. He said you had a wound in your abdomen." Her mother turned to her, sounding a bit anxious. "Was there any permanent damage?" "No." The question rubbed her wrong, and she couldn't figure out why. "There are more concerns about my wrist." "And the splinching?" Her face scrunched in confusion. "Yes, the splinching. Will it harm you in the future?" "No, but recovery is going to take time." "You could come stay with us in the safe house while you recover." Her mother placed a hand on hers, something that was supposed to be maternal, yet put her on edge. "I would be more comfortable if you were." Hermione frowned. "I don't want to inconvenience you both. You are our daughter. You were attacked and injured. You should be with your family this time." This time. Because the last time she'd stayed at the Burrow when she was first released. Not that she had any other options. Her parents had still been in Australia, but she knew her mother carried some resentment about how heavily she'd ended up leaning on Molly, as well as Andromeda. "Your dad and actually," her dad gave her mother a hard look, "if this is the place where she can get the most help she needs, then I'm fine, as long as we can visit." "I'm certain they won't mind," Hermione said slowly, still looking between her parents. Things were tense. "We don't even know these people," her mother's voice lowered. "Aren't they bigots?" "At one point, yes, but things have changed drastically. I've been working with Narcissa since April. They have the space set up, my work is here, my friends can visit, and if I need something, they have a house elf that can help me. It's ideal." "What about Ron?" The look her mother received from both Hermione and her father made her stop and change course. "No, I didn't mean it like that. What I meant was, what about staying with one of your close friends? I'm certain there are other options. Don't get me wrong, it's a lovely home, but they're strangers." "Not to me." Hermione extracted her hand from underneath her mother's. "They've opened their home, and it's the best option until I'm strong enough to return home. Safe houses are small. You don't have room for me, nor does any safe house have a flu connection set up for my healers to come through. And we are trying to be here for you, Hermione." Her mother looked endlessly frustrated. "Why won't you let us?" "We, of course, respect your wishes." Her dad's comment was pointed. "The Aurors gave us access to a telephone. Just ring us if you need anything, even if it's to talk." He drew her in his arms and smoothed down her hair. Hermione held on and shut her eyes for a moment of peace, but it was interrupted. "Or she should come with us and we'll sort this out as a family." With her father no longer playing peacekeeper, and her mother's stubbornness on full display, their bickering stretched longer than usual. But it faded into the background, leaving only one word stirring something inside of her. Had she been in a better mental, physical, and emotional state, Hermione would have let the comment go. But alas, she wasn't, and thus was sent careening over the edge and falling before she knew it. "Family!" The word caught in her throat, but she forced it out in the midst of a rueful and wet chuckle. "Mum, I have waited years for you to say that while referring to the three of us." Their argument died. Love. Another word that felt odd coming from her mother given their distance. I know we might not agree on a lot of things, but we have always been a family. No, we haven't. Hermione looked at her for the first time. I have my faults in this. I am not sure I will ever atone for them, but I'll make peace with the fact that I have tried. Hermione. Her mother exhaled her name like one would an errant child. I told you we forgive you. You don't act like it. You shut me out, and now you want me to pretend everything is fine. It's not. We can work on it. Mum. She lowered her voice, took a series of measured breaths, and tried to hold down her emotions. There is a very large part of me that has been starving for this moment, that has been waiting desperately for you to say this, but it's tainted. Her dad's hand on hers made Hermione realize just how badly she was shaking, how badly she was unraveling. I'm here now, Hermione. Her mother reached for her, but Hermione drew away and rose to her feet. She swayed from the sheer force of effort it took. I am sorry for how I acted. I have regrets about things and would like the opportunity to fix this. Let me try. Let us take care of you. Tears blurred Hermione's vision and slipped down her cheeks as she shook her head. I'm not supposed to stress myself, and the idea of going with you does just that. She had to ignore the hurt look on her mother's face for her own sanity. You and I have had years to fix us, and we haven't. Right now, I am at the point where I can only work to heal myself. I don't have the energy to fix us, too. Maybe I will in the future, if the offer is still on the table when I'm ready. I don't know. I can't think about that now. You should focus on healing. There was an unfamiliar edge in her father's voice, and he was looking at the source of it. I think we should go. Her mother looked incredulous. We have been arguing about this for months, and now that I'm trying, you're telling me to stop. Now isn't the time. Before she could continue arguing with her father, a dry, brittle chuckle escaped Hermione's lips. I've waited so long for you to say this. Emotions made her head pound. It was hard to speak without swallowing the lump in her throat. But, Mom, it took me nearly dying for you to see me and try to meet me on the common ground that I have been begging for. And even then, it has to happen on your way, on your terms. Hermione. Her name didn't come from her mother's mouth, or even her father's. The voice belonged to someone wholly unexpected. Narcissa. She hadn't heard her entrance or approach. None of them had, but Narcissa was at her side in seconds, and she looked none too pleased. I believe it is time for your potions. She had another 15 minutes, but Hermione didn't argue. Narcissa's smile was like a decorative dagger, beautiful yet sharp enough to draw blood. Apologies for the interruption. Narcissa's expression softened slightly when she nodded in her father's direction. Mr. Granger, please excuse us. Hand around her shoulder, Narcissa was ready to steer her away. Hermione only exchanged a sad look with her father before they both nodded in silent agreement that this wouldn't be it for them. And then she turned to leave. Her first steps were unsteady, slow, and as heavy as her heart. I wasn't finished speaking with my daughter. Narcissa stopped and looked over her shoulder. The defensive chill in her voice made Hermione lean into her side just a fraction more. Yes, Mrs. Granger, I believe you are. Numbness seeped into her skin and settled into her bones. Hermione wanted to yell. The urge was as physical as the tears streaming out of her eyes as she took one deep, shaky breath after the next. After the next. After the next. But nothing would come. It felt like she'd taken an anesthetic of loss, a drug that would either wear off in a few hours when she gave herself time to process the conversation with her mother, or one that would never leave her system, no matter how much calming drafts she took. Hermione ran a hand through her hair, feeling hysterical, like a visitor inside her own skin. A familiar tingling sensation started in her fingers, and she steeled herself for what was to come. Thoughts, panic, overanalysis, regret. Everything was poised to collapse on top of her. She fell into the same darkness she had just woken from. Hermione sank deeper and deeper,
letting herself slip into the solitude of her own heartache. Just for a moment, that was all Hermione was willing to allow herself. Lower, closer to the void. But as she approached rock bottom, she found herself back at the surface. Draco wrapped a blanket over her shoulders, and all she could do was blink at him. Then her surroundings. He sat on the coffee table in front of her. His face gave nothing away. She didn't remember how she'd gotten to his office. Your parents have returned to the safe house. Funny how 8 words could hurt so much. Hermione's eyes fluttered shut, and she felt hot tears roll down her cheeks against her own will. She felt like she'd cried more over the last few days than in the last few years. She heard him start to stand, and stopped him by reaching out and lifting her eyes to meet his. Never before had she felt so unsure of herself. "Are you leaving?" "No." The next thing she knew, his lips pressed against her forehead, warm and rough, but so achingly tender. Hermione inhaled sharply, taking in the smell of him all over again, and then his finger curled under her chin and lifted without the resistance that was woven into the fabric of who she was. There was depth in his eyes, strength in the silence of his stance, warmth when he leaned in the final breath to cover her mouth with his. He tasted like survival, revival. Like breathing pure oxygen, kissing Draco replenished her. Perhaps they both needed this moment, this exchange, the give and take that would lead to balance. They had been through things both separately and together, a complete journey neither of them fully understood, but they silently relied on the other's presence. Hermione brought her hand to his cheek. Draco mirrored her action, and the moment was akin to discovering all the mysterious functions of life itself. Their lips met again. The next connection offered no heat, just desire for contact, pouring into her empty well through parted lips. Comfort curbed the pain until there was nothing left. Tranquility carefully unraveled something in her chest only for him. They ended up lying on the sofa with her wrist carefully cradled on his chest. One of his arms curled around her, and the other rested on the curve of her waist. She couldn't see him, but knew he was watching, waiting for her to talk. "I think I told you a little about the row with my mother in May." "You did." "In hindsight, I think my dad has always been trying in his own way. He's not the most vocal person, but he always lets me watch him paint while listening to music." She tore her eyes away from the ceiling. "I took his silence as a slight, but now I realize that that's always been his way of trying to keep the door open." "And your mother?" "My mother..." Hermione tried to arrange her thoughts into something comprehensible. "I think she took the memory charm the hardest. She and I have the same sort of control issues. I worked myself to the bone trying to please her with the hope of fixing what was broken, but all I have left are bleeding cuts on my fingers and missing pieces that don't fit. Maybe it'll never be completely whole. Maybe this is as good as it'll get." "My mother and I have a similar sort of imperfect truce." She sucked in a breath at his honesty. "One day we might get there as well." Hermione shifted slightly, feeling a bit of discomfort on her side. "I do understand her worries. I know my faults in all this. Perhaps I didn't need to say what I said in May, but I still stand by it. Being alone and happy is better than being with someone and miserable. My relationship with Ron wasn't always bad, but it was over years before he broke it off. It was complicated, and neither of us made things better simply by being who we were naturally. I wasn't happy." "Are you now?" It was a question Hermione hadn't expected. "I am. Mostly." The truth left her raw under his gaze. "Dissatisfaction is always beneath the surface, reminding me of its presence." "Loneliness," a voice reminded her. One she saw in herself and in him. It was always there, lingering. It was even in her hallucinations. "Are you still lost, Draco?" She lifted her eyes to his. "Are you?" "More than ever." Lost in the same sort of isolation she often felt in her own mind, Hermione rolled with the feeling of desolation. A piece inside her wanted desperately to connect, but it was all trapped, uncertain. It was human nature. That was what everyone said. Loneliness was supposed to be a symptom of a bigger issue, though she couldn't help but wonder if it was actually the disease. It wasn't the sort that made Hermione wish for a life within the comfort of her own home. No, she didn't want that. But maybe it was the sort of disease that would make her reach out for companionship to help mend the broken pieces. Not to disguise the cracks or erase them altogether, but perhaps connection could be the lacquer needed to fuse it all together with her identity still intact. Just stronger, stable, content. And right now she wanted nothing more than to feel the same contentment outside of those little snatches of time with Draco and Scorpius. She wanted to feel it all the time, but she was uncertain how to ask. The words were drowned out by the silence in her mind, and she was exhausted from wanting something she couldn't verbalize. "I'm tired." Hermione tried to fight back the swell in her heart that threatened to return. "Then you should rest." "My mind spins and weaves and tries to keep fixing everything too. Never mind. I'm just tired of having to hold every piece of myself together when I feel like I'm falling apart. But I have to because I'm not weak." "Not a word I would associate with you, no." "I can handle the pressure and the pain." "Just because you can doesn't mean you have to." Draco gave her a pointed look. "Your words." A slow smile appeared. "It's not like you listened." "Not then, no." "And now?" When Draco didn't answer, Hermione absently reached for him with her bandaged hand. Her fingertips skimmed the angle of his jaw. The pain from the action was dull, but she couldn't focus on anything beyond how tired he appeared. "You should rest too." "I have a few things left to do before I sleep." "What are you going to do?" "Work, but not alone. I'm learning to delegate." Draco's thumb covered a bruise above the bandages on her wrist. "You should practice all the things you preach." "Maybe I should." Hermione was heavy with exhaustion. "Everything feels out of my control right now." Her eyes slipped shut, but she held on to her tether and hoped she wouldn't drift too far. But she did anyway. They both did. When Hermione woke the first time, she was half on top of him with her head on his chest, listening to him breathe deeply. The rhythm put her back to sleep, and she dreamt of nothing. The second time was different. She was roused by the sensation of falling. And she was, but not really. He was putting her to bed in a dimly lit room, her guest room. He pressed his knees into the mattress as one arm slid from under her knees, and the other moved from under her back. Hermione hissed at the discomfort of her unbandaged arm. Her skin was itchy and pulled too tight, unfamiliar, inflamed to the touch. The exchange was silent, a question and a look and permission granted when Hermione slowly raised her arms. She helped as much as she could when he peeled the shirt off, and turned her head away as he took in the sight of her battered skin and inflamed marks. Leaning back, she let him slowly work off the loose joggers she'd been wearing. Modesty rose in her mind alongside embarrassment. He'd never seen her like this before. But she turned on her side and left her bare back facing him. The bed dipped when Draco sat on the edge, and she shuddered not long after from the instant relief found in the application of a minty balm. "Let it breathe." She barely heard him even in the silent room. "Sit up." Hermione did so slowly, arms folded over her breasts, and her eyes fluttered shut as his thumb swept over the marks on her neck. "Could you grab me a larger shirt?" It was clear her question startled him. "I'm not ashamed of my injuries. I'm just cold." Draco did the last thing Hermione expected, and stood, removed his own shirt, and offered it to her. When she tentatively accepted, he helped her put it on, fitted on him, but oversized on her. Hermione drowned in the shirt that smelled like all the scents she associated with him, only stronger, concentrated in the weave of the fabric. "Stay." Draco never answered, but when he waved his hand, the door shut and the lock clicked. Stepping close enough for his legs to brush her knees, Hermione found herself unable to ignore the small connection and the warmth of his body. Life thrummed beneath the surface of his skin. Hermione's eyes traced up the band of his joggers, his abs and scarred chest, the muscles of his arms, and the sudden peeling back of a certain glamour. No longer a blank canvas, color drenched his arm as his tattoo slowly took shape. The stillness between them felt akin to the suspense of a breath caught on an inhale. The dragon. Hermione had known of its existence for months. She knew it covered much of his arm, and had seen it from a distance. But seeing the work of art up close was a completely different experience. Taking her time to admire the detailing, she examined its scales and spines, claws and tucked wings. Sinuous and slender, she could see the strength in its muscular legs and feel the fury of the fire it blew. Majestic and terrifying, yet oddly somber. Fierce and invincible, except for its belly. Its weak spot was layered above the scarred flesh of his past, and highlighted by the connected dots of a familiar constellation. Draco's eyes were lowered, body tense under her observation, but he turned his arm for her to see. See him, completely, just as he'd seen her. Curiosity inspired Hermione. As more seconds passed, she grew bolder. Like the man who carved his heart on his sleeve, there was more to the tattoo than the dragon itself. Hermione confirmed as much when Draco reached to adjust the collar of the shirt where it had slipped down her shoulder. The movement allowed her to catch sight of the rose and the narcissus flowers entwined on his inner upper arm. She knew instantly who that piece belonged to. Beautiful, but a painfully tender area to etch. The irony of how well it paralleled their relationship was not lost on Hermione, and she would have spared more thoughts about it had she not caught letters trailing down the side of the dragon. Letters that formed two words. Temet nosce. What does it mean? Know thyself. Draco retracted his arm and rested it against his side. Wise words from a friend. Hermione took a chance. Your best friend? There was no hesitation. Yes. Draco turned away, and just when Hermione was in danger of being distracted by his back muscles, just when she thought there was no more to see, something curious caught her eye. On the back of his arm, above a few small daphnes dancing in the breeze of their own, was an olive tree. Its trunk was wide with age and deep, sure roots, but the ink looked different from the rest. Is the tree new? Yes. Olive trees mean peace. Something Draco said he was making with himself. Perhaps this was his symbol. The thought dissolved in the minutes it took to arrange themselves on the bed. Draco didn't seem too keen on lying down just yet. Whispers of his aversion tickled her ear. So he sat up with his back against the headboard. Her hips rested between his legs as she leaned her back against his chest. She focused on each rise and fall of his chest, and the weight of his arms wrapped around her. Hermione ran her fingers absently against the dragon's scales. It made her feel things she couldn't articulate. The lights were dim. It was hard to see, but it was already burned into her memory. Hermione broke the tentative silence with a bold question. Why a tattoo? Why gardening? Touché. Hermione noted the prickliness in his avoidance. I told you once that gardening made me understand that we're all connected, and my tattoo is a reminder of that. She closed her mouth. Never had she understood him more than in that moment. Fingers grazed her neck again, and she tilted her head. You don't have to stay here tonight. I know your preference. It's fine. Why do you sleep on the sofa? Draco didn't answer immediately, which was better than any reaction she'd expected. Astoria. The name came with much hesitation, but Draco exhaled as if he'd crossed the first hurdle. It was quicker to get off a sofa than out of a bed in a different room when she got too quiet. Easier to check. Hermione's chest constricted as she filled in the blanks, to see if she was still breathing. She felt sick. It became a habit. His voice lowered just a bit. She wondered if it was out of deepening discomfort. This was uncharted territory for them both. I'm not sure if I can sleep in a bed without waking up to make sure. I'm sorry I asked. Instinct made her reach for his hand. There was a slight tremor that stilled when her fingers covered his. It wasn't my business. I chose to answer. Why? Hermione's question was barely a whisper. You don't talk about her much. I would if I had the words. She felt his heartbeat against her back. Quick, like nerves, yet he didn't stop, or move, or leave. Perhaps talking like this was easiest. What was she like? Draco's account of her was the only one she didn't have. For some reason, the way he saw her meant more in Hermione's eyes.
Her husband would be the truest testament of her character. Subtle, strong, in tune with everyone around her, much like Scorpius, which made her deliberate in everything she did and all the words she spoke. Like you too. I learned to choose my words wisely. She taught me patience and tolerance, helped me understand and begin the act of breaking from tradition and starting to think for myself. His thumb swiped over the grooves of her knuckles. Even when I was a selfish bastard running from my demons, Astoria never gave up on me. It wasn't in her nature to give up. She loved Scorpius more than anything. Film, art, the stars. She sounds remarkable. Hermione quietly wished that she'd had the opportunity to know her. There was so much she still wanted to know, so much she could only learn from her. Draco shifted behind her, seeming to get more comfortable, as did she. I've never lost anyone that close to me. Friends that she missed dearly, but not a spouse, not a best friend. I don't know how you feel. Sometimes I don't either. Draco's voice was low and hush. I spent years working to keep her alive, brewing potions and improving upon them. Theo purchased St. Mungo's and quietly assisted in experimenting with strengthening the potions each time they began to lose potency. She didn't talk to him after we were married. She never knew. Hermione's heart ached for all of them. When we reached the end, when we ran out of options, I had time to prepare and plan, but in the end, I wasn't ready. Scorpius and I were strangers. I think she was the only person ready. Were you with her? No. A small breath escaped him. I gave them time. It took days, but he talked to her until the end. Them. He. Theo. Both poetic and painful. No matter how arranged their marriage was, she didn't know too many men that would have stepped aside for their dying wife's first love to claim their last moments. Pain, grief, and pride would have ultimately gotten in the way. But not then. Not with him. Theo's respect for Draco made perfect sense. The promises he's made. Draco shifted closer. It is how well you live that matters, not how long. Astoria said that all the time. It sounded like a thank you, confirmation of satisfaction in a life neither of them chose. Maybe a love all their own. I've made a lot of mistakes, before and since. Haven't we all? She turned her head, catching sight of him looking away in her peripheral vision. Daphne said you were her best friend. Yes, but that wasn't automatic. I wasn't the person you are now. Draco took a deep breath, and then another. Not even close. About a year into our marriage, a year of me ignoring her, she nearly died. I knew it was possible, but seeing it changed everything. Saving her shaped our friendship and helped me figure things out. I took my duty to her more seriously. We tried, but neither of us could muster anything more. So we settled for what we had. When she was well enough for longer stretches of time, she started talking about children. Daphne said she wanted him for you. I didn't understand why she wanted so desperately to take the risk until you held him. Draco's silence was confirmation of a note she'd read so many months before. Were you happy? I was content. He fell silent, and Hermione caught sight of his contemplation. I struggle with the concept of happiness. It's not permanent. What is found can be stripped away. I've seen it happen. But there are moments when you can't help but feel it. Hermione took in his features, thinking back to each one of his quirked smiles, the way he quietly marveled over his son, and the way he looked in the moments of stillness, when everything was right. Sometimes she thought she saw hints of it when they were alone. He didn't get too many. Recovering from my seizure wasn't easy. Parts of me empathize with your mother losing memories because I lost time, independence, and my sense of self. I let go of all my dreams and took a different path. But I learned that recovery isn't always quick. Parts of me ache about this, but I've made my peace.
She tilted her head and rested her ear against the hand that he'd placed on her shoulder, feeling odd and vulnerable. As for happiness, well, carving out my own was a wild, ferocious fight for my life, but I'd do it all over again, because you're right. Happiness isn't permanent. It's a goal I work towards, and I'm far from perfect. I think you may know my issues as well as I do, but I have no regrets. I'm still learning. Hermione felt his cheek on her head and heard him inhale. She expected nothing else, but got far more. My regrets don't lie with my marriage. Draco paused for a long moment. In the end, I learned from her, because of her, and now I have a chance to execute each lesson she taught. Her stomach twisted at the words. It's late, which also translated to the conversation ending. It was far more awkward settling into bed than a sofa. Draco was tense at first, but it slowly bled away, then more when the lights shut off, even more when he turned his head towards her. Sliding an arm under the pillow, she carefully placed her wrapped wrist on his chest and tucked her body against his side. Draco wasted no time tipping her chin up and adding a layer of intimacy to their current position by kissing her deeply. Soon it diminished to the simple act of their lips touching, a unique closeness that could only happen once pretense was shed and there was nothing left, except them. Why don't you know what you want? The question caught Hermione by surprise, but her instinctive response shocked her more. It's already hard for the wildly independent part of my mind to ask for basic necessities. Asking for wants is more difficult. Your altruism is aggravating. I don't know how to be selfish. I don't feel it's necessary to ask for things I want. Sometimes it's hard enough just to cut through the noise in my head. Or maybe you're afraid. I am. Her confession was nothing more than a whisper. Of a lot of things I shouldn't fear because they're beyond my control and larger than myself. You. The thought stopped her cold, but she forced herself to move on, revisit it another day when she could. Aren't you afraid? In the dark, all things were unclear, and so was his answer. For a myriad of reasons. Hermione could list the source of his possible fears and quietly related to each. I think it takes courage to admit fear. I am not courageous, Granger. You're more courageous than you think. Silence stretched into something as tangible as Draco's hand in her curls, but when he stilled, she noticed his breathing change, deepen, and even. Hers unconsciously fell into rhythm. Slower. Hermione gave herself to sleep as an exhausted offer, and it accepted, consuming her completely. No dreams or nightmares, only a field of flowers. There was a weight in her hand and a shadow beneath her. She wasn't alone. Our wounds are often the openings into the best and most beautiful parts of us. David Rico.